Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Daled and Mirza Hashem today. We will be learning Daf Reish Tes Vav Amid Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today on the top line of Reish Tes Vav Amid Aleph. Actually, we're going to pick up on the second line, at least in my print, on Reish Tes Vav Amid Aleph in Siman Shin Samach in the middle of Sif Aleph by the words V'chein Hadin. Our learning should be a schus for Achenu Kobeis Yisrael, Hanesunim Batzaru Ba'Shivya, Ha'imdim Bei Bayam Ubein Bei Abasha, Hamakim Yirachim Aleihim, V'yetziam Yitzar L'Rvacha Me'afelu La'ira Mishibur L'Geula, Hashta B'Gala V'Zman Kariv and Emar Amen. Our learning should be a schus Refuah Shalema for Meiri V'Rabbi Reb Shalom Ruvain Ben Shima for Achya Godel, Moshe Meir Ben Esther Fradel, Yitzchak Ben Sion Ben Dusha, Rivka Bashir Leah, Chava Hadassah Bas Rezel Serel, Yeshua Levi Ben Ahuva Malka Chanan, Gila Shufra Bas Ilan Udel. They should all have a Refuah Shalema B'Sar Shar Chayei Yisrael. So, yesterday we began Siman Shin Samach, and the Mechaber told us a very basic halacha. The Mechaber told us about a case where you have a Yachid Sheshavas Bibika. You have an individual who apparently is traveling, and he's out in the Bika. We mentioned yesterday that a Bika is a Carmelis, right? A Bika is a nice big open area that is not enclosed by mechitzais, so it's not a Rishus HaYachid, but it's also not a Rishus HaRabim, it's not a Mokum Hiluch HaRabim, so what is it? It's a Carmelis. What's the halacha of a Carmelis? You're not allowed to be metaltal, Yoiser Midalad Amas, in a Carmelis. Okay, this person is out in the Bika, and he realizes that he's going to have to spend Shabbos in the Bika. He doesn't want to spend Shabbos out in a Carmelis where he can't move anything more than Dalad Amas. So what does he want to do? He wants to enclose a little encampment around himself so that he has an area where he could spend Shabbos and he could move things around inside that area. So he goes and he gets some basic supplies and he makes an enclosure. But the enclosure that he makes is it's using mechitzais geruais, very halachically weak mechitzais. What's weak about these mechitzais? Well, the Mechaber told us what he's doing is he's making mechitzais that only go in one direction. So, for example, he's making mechitzais out of shesi without erev. Shesi is vertical posts. So what he's doing is he's enclosing an area by putting up vertical posts. And each one of these vertical posts is close to the one next to it, and the gap between them is not more than the sheer limud. So he's putting up vertical posts, and between each vertical post, the gap is less than 3 tvachim. And he keeps on putting up these vertical posts until he encloses an area around himself. Now, midaraisa, if he puts up these posts, and the posts are taller than 10 tvachim, and the area that he's enclosing is bigger than daled al daled, he has just created a Rishus HaYachid midaraisa, because lavud is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So these vertical posts, they create a perfectly halachically acceptable mechitza, an enclosure around the area midaraisa, and this is a full-fledged Rishus HaYachid. However, the Chazal said that a mechitza that's constructed of vertical posts only, so that it's shesi b'loi erev, is a mechitza gerua. It's a weak mechitza. And therefore, the Chazal put a restriction on him. What's the restriction? He could enclose an area up to a beis sasayim. Up to 5,000 square amas, he could enclose an area using a mechitza gerua like shesi b'loi erev. Or he could do erev b'loi shesi. He could put up horizontal ropes, and he could put up one rope and then another rope above it with a gap of less than 3 tvachim between the ropes, and another rope on top of that until he reaches a height of 10 tvachim off the ground. And now he's creating an enclosure of erev, of horizontal, b'loi shesi, without vertical. That's also a mechitza gerua. Same halacha applies. He could enclose an area up to a beis sasayim. Up to 5,000 square amas, he could enclose such an area. The interior of those enclosures is now a Rishus HaYachid, and in there he could be metaltal as much as he wants. He could move things from one end to the other. He could be metaltal yois midal amas without a problem. But what's the restriction that Chazal placed on him? When you're using mechitzais geruais, you could only enclose an area up to a beis sasayim. Larger than a beis sasayim, if you go to 5,010 square amas, really 5,001 square amas, 5,000.5 square amas. Once you exceed a beis sasayim, now these mechitzais geruais are ineffective. Midrabanan, midaraisa, this is still a rishos hayachid, but midrabanan, these mechitzais geruais are ineffective once you're larger than 5,000 square amas, and now that area reverts back to being a regular karmelis, and now you're not allowed to be metaltal yosim midalat amos inside that enclosure. So that's the halacha that we learned yesterday. Now let's go weiter, and the Mechaber says, the Mechaber's second line down, Reish Tes Vav Amud Aleph. V'chein adin imheim shnayim. The same halacha would apply if it's not a yochid sheshavas bebika. Let's say two people were traveling together, and the two of them are spending Shabbos out in an encampment in the bika. They have the same restriction. They want to enclose an area using mechitzais geruais. They're limited by 5,000 square amas. They're limited by a beis sasayim. Up to a beis sasayim, they could enclose, and in there they could be metaltal yosim midalat amas. But again, if they exceed a beis sasayim, if it's bigger than 5,000 square amas, it goes back to being a karmelis, and they could only be metaltal up to dalat amas. That's what the Mechaber says here. V'chein adin imhein shnayim. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut involved. V'chein adin imhein shnayim. Ritzaynu loymar. What the Mechaber wants to say is the gam bozeh. In this case as well, where there are two people, ein noisdim lishneihem biyachad rak ad beis sasayim. They only get up to a beis sasayim. Now let's go weiter, says the Mechaber, near the middle of line 2. V'imheim shloisha Yisraelim. But what if it's not one, it's not two, it's three? What if you have three Yidden that are out in the bika together, and they're creating an encampment for all three of them? V'imheim shloisha Yisraelim. Now we have a new din. Imheim shloisha Yisraelim chashuvim kishayara. Three Yidden traveling together now constitutes a caravan, a shayara. And a shayara has a different din. On a shayara, we're more makel. Says the Mechaber, Meim Shloisha Yisraelim Chashuvim Kishayara. Now they're a shayara. Umutal Taltal Bekulai. And now they could enclose a very large area. Afilu hu Gadol Harbe. Once you have three people, you could use a mechitza gerua, shesi b'lay erev, erev b'lay shesi, and you could enclose a massive area. And it's going to be considered a rishos hayachid, and you could be metaltal yosim midalat amas inside the whole thing. But there's a caveat. Ubelvad shelo yakifu yosim mikidei tzorcham. However, yes, they could enclose a large area, but they can't just enclose a huge area where there's going to be a tremendous amount of empty space that they're not going to use. What does that mean? They should not leave a 5,000 square amma area empty that they're not going to use. If they do that, if they enclose such a large area that they have a beis sasayim, they have a 5,000 square amma of their enclosure that is empty and is not being used, then it ruins the whole enclosure. Then ein metaltalin b'chol amukaf ela ba'arba amis. Then again the mechitzas become ineffective, and you're not allowed to carry more than dalat amis anywhere inside this enclosure. One more caveat, and then we'll kind of give a sikum on this whole thing. When is this true? That you have this limitation, that you cannot enclose a tremendous area where you have a beis sasayim that's not being used. When does that limitation kick in? When you have three people and they're exceeding 15,000, I guess, right? 6 sa'in. No, a sa is 2,500. 2 sa's 5,000. Yeah, 15,000. Kishekifu yoiser al sheish sa'in. where they exceed 6 square saw. Aval im lo yikifu yoser al sheish saw, but up to 6 saw, af al pi sheyesh sasayim panui, even though there might be a base sasayim that is enclosed, that's not being used, Kaven Shem Shloisha, since there are 3 people in this enclosure, mutter, they get a freebie of 2,000, they get a freebie of 2 saw per person. They get a freebie of 5,000 square amas per person. Okay, so what are we saying over here? Let's kind of wrap it up and put it together. The first halacha that the Mechaber told me is a yachid, a single person that's traveling out in the Bika. He wants to enclose an area, so he should be able to be metaltal yoser midalad amas inside that area. He could use a mechitza gerua to enclose an area. He could use shesi b'loy erev, erev b'loy shesi. He could make an enclosure, and now he's allowed to be metaltal yoser midalad amas inside that enclosure. But he has a limitation. The limitation is that he could only enclose an area with the mechitza gerua up to 5,000 square amas. If he wants to use a real bona fide mechitza, if he wants to use shesi and erev, if he wants to go vertical posts and horizontal, then he's making bona fide mechitzas. He's making a real rishus hayachid. He could go as big as he wants. But if he's using a mechitza gerua, he's limited to a beis sasayim. He's limited to 5,000 square amas. Up to 5,000 square amas, put up your mechitza gerua, you can be metaltal as much as you want. What happens if you go over 5,000 square amas with a mechitza gerua? You ruin the whole thing. You go 5,001 square amas with a mechitza gerua, it voids all of the mechitzas. Now you're back to being in a carmelis. You can't be metaltal yoser midalad amas. What if 2 people are traveling together and they want to make an encampment together? Same exact halacha as 1 person. Again, they're limited to a beis sasayim. They're limited to 5,000 square amas. If they exceed it, their area turns back into a carmelis. What if you have 3 people that are traveling together? Once you hit 3 people, a new halacha kicks in. Once you hit 3 people, now you're classified as a shayara. You're classified as a caravan. Okay, what happens now? Well, the first thing you should know is, if you have 3 people together, right away you get a freebie. You get 5,000 square amas per person. Each person gets a beis sasayim. So since you're 3 people, 6,000 square amas, no problem. Right away you could enclose an area. I'm sorry, not 6,000 square amas. I keep messing that up. 6 saw, 15,000 square amas, right? Now you could get a beis sasayim, 5,000 square amas for each individual. So you have 3 individuals. You could go ahead and enclose 6 saw with a mechitza gerua, and we don't care how much empty space there happens to be. Maybe you're going to go ahead and you're going to enclose an area of 6 saw, and maybe factually, over Shabbos, you're only going to use a beis sasayim. So there's going to be 4 saw that are panui, that are empty, that you're not using. You don't put a paper cup there. You don't do anything. There's going to be 4 saw that are panui and not being used. Doesn't matter. Why? 3 people, a beis sasayim to each. That's a freebie without any restrictions. But if you go over the 6 saw limit, so let's say you go ahead and they enclose an area of 7 saw. So now they went over the 6 saw limitation. Okay, depends. If they're going to use 7 saw, go ahead, no problem. They enclosed 8 saw, no problem. If you're going to use 8 saw, you want to spread out, you got a lot of stuff. If you're going to use 8 saw, no problem. But if you go over the 6 saw limit for 3 people, right? Let's say you enclose 7 saw and you only use 5. Now you went over 6 and you have 2,000. You have a beis sasayim that's panui. That's a problem. If you go over the 6 saw limit for 3 people and you leave a beis sasayim, you leave 2 saw panui that you don't use, now you've voided all of your mechitzas and now you're back to being in a carmelis. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Zayin. The Mechaber said that the three people, if they leave a Beis Hasayim Ponui, then you're not allowed to carry more than Daled Amas B'chol Hamukaf, anywhere in the enclosure. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Zayin T'chashvina l'chal ha'mechitza ki'ilu eina, because now you have voided all of the mechitzas. Ois Katan Ches, when does this limitation kick in? When does this caveat kick in? That you can't have a Beis Hasayim that's ponui and not being used, and if you do it invalidates all of the mechitzos. That's ois katan ches kishe kifu yisrael al sheish. That's when you exceeded the 6 saw freebie that 3 people get. Explains the Mishnah Berurah, the sheish saw inhu l'shloisha anoshim. You get 6 saw for 3 people. L'chol echad Beis Hasayim. Each one is entitled to 2 saw. So 3 people, shayara, 6 saw you get. And we don't care how much you leave empty. But v'heim hikifu yoser. But they exceeded the 6 saw limit. Kigoin sheva. For example, they enclosed an area of 7 saw. V'loy hitzraku ela l'chamesh. But they're only using 5. So they went over the 6 saw that 3 people are entitled to, which they could. You could go over the 6 saw if you're going to use whatever you enclose. But they went over the 6 saw, they went to 7 saw, but they're only using 5 saw. So now they're leaving 2 saw empty. So now there's a Beis Hasayim which is empty. And now the entire enclosure is going to become Asur. But if they don't exceed the 6 saw limit, since 3 people get an automatic give me of 6 saw, then we don't care if there's 2 saw that's empty. So they did 6 saw and they only need 2 and they leave 4 empty. We don't care. That's fine. Again, the 6 saw is a gimme. The 6 saw is a freebie for 3 people. See, the Taz tell Yerabba, the Gon Yaakov, they say, all the Rishonim argue on what the Mechaber just said here. The Daitam, the Af B'Pachos Mishesh, the opinion of most Rishonim is that even if, when you have 3 people, even if they enclosed less than 6 saw, Kol Sheyesh Sasayim Panei Osir. Whenever you have 2 saw that's empty, that creates a problem, and then the entire enclosure would be Asur B'Tiltel Yosem B'Daled Amos. Okay, we have a Ramah here to close out Sif Aleph. Says the Ramah Hagah, if you notice, the Mechaber said very clearly that in order to have the din of a Shayara, you need Shloisha Yisraelim. You need 3 Yidden. Says the Ramah Hagah, Ein Yehudi Ein Mitzaref L'Shayara. If you have Reuven, Shimon, and Tony, that does not create a shayara. There are those that say that a katan, a minor, also is not mitzaref. So if you have Reuven and Shimon, and you have Shimon's 6-year-old son, that does not constitute a shayara. You don't have 3 adults, and the halacha of a shayara would not kick in. Okay, now we're going to go to Sif Beis. Now, okay, you know what, Sif Beis doesn't need a Hagdama. Let's do Sif Beis quickly. Hayu Shloisha. So you had 3 people, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, and they're traveling out in the Bikah, right? So you have a shayara, right? Hayu shloisha, v'hikifu kol tzarcham. So 3 people, you have a shayara. They decided that they need 10,000 square amas. So okay, they enclosed a 10,000 square. I'm sorry, I keep getting mixed up between the English numbers, so to speak. You know, the numerals and the saw. So you have 3 people, and they went ahead and they enclosed an area, let's say, of 8 saw, because they decided that they need 8 saw. Remember, they're allowed to go over the 6. If they're going to use it, they're allowed to go over the 6. So they go to 8. They surrounded an area of 8 saw, and they're using 8 saw. So everything is Shalom al Yisrael. Everything is fantastic. Hayu shloisha, v'kifu kol tzarcham. They enclosed whatever they need, and then tragedy strikes. Umeis echad b'Shabbos. One of them died over Shabbos. Maybe they're out in the bikkah and a snake got him. I don't know. One of them died on Shabbos. Now how many people do you have? You only have two. Two, you don't have the din of a shayara. Two, you're only entitled to a beis sasayim. Right? Two is just like one. You only get 2 sa. You get a beis sasayim. They went ahead and they enclosed 8 sa, counting on the halacha of a shayara. But now they're not a shayara. Now they're only 2 people. Says the Mechaber mutarim b'chal Shabbos. They remain mutter to be metaltal yoyse b'dalad amas in the entire enclosure for the entirety of that Shabbos, not the next Shabbos, but for the entirety of that Shabbos, they could use their entire enclosure. Because they went into Shabbos following the halacha, doing the right thing. They're good for that Shabbos. Now, the opposite case. Hayushnayim, let's say there were 2 people, Reuven and Shimon. They're only entitled to beis sasayim, right? They're only entitled to 5,000 square amas. Hayushnayim, v'kifu yoyse b'sasayim. They did not follow the halacha. There were only 2 people. They're only entitled to 2 sa. They went ahead and they enclosed an area of 6 sa, right? Not allowed to do that. So what's the halacha? They're not allowed to be metaltal yoyse b'dalad amas inside their enclosure. They blew it. They made a nice big enclosure with bechitzos geruos, shesi b'loy erev, erev b'loy shesi, and then they realized, we clutched up. We're not entitled to such a big enclosure. We're only allowed a beis sasayim. Now that we exceeded a beis sasayim, we're at a karmelis. We're not allowed to be metaltal yoyse b'dalad amas. But then what happened? V'nisvasvu aleim b'Shabbos. And now somebody comes walking in the bikkah, Levi comes walking along, and he says, could I join you in your enclosure? Now, you might think, if he comes into the enclosure, now he just turned them into a shayara. Now they could use their whole enclosure, because now they're a shayara. Says the Mechaber, no. Ke asurim. They're just as asur as they were before. They're not allowed to be metaltal yoyse b'dalad amas. Why? Ke v'shenichna Shabbos be'isser. Because they went into this be'isser. So, that isser is going to haunt them for the entire Shabbos. Says the Mishnah Berurah's contest b'chal Shabbos v'tzad alarma dafka la'oisa Shabbos. The first case of the Mechaber, where there was a heter, they started with 3 and then 1 die. They remain mutter to be metaltal yoyse b'dalad amas b'chal Shabbos for the entirety of Shabbos. V'tzad alarma dafka la'oisa Shabbos, but only for that Shabbos. Aval Shabbos acheres, if they're still out in the bikkah next Shabbos, they have to rectify the situation. Also, they can't go into the next Shabbos with a too large enclosure. That would be also. Ice cut and yud, if there were 2 and another person came to join, asurim, they remain osir. Return alarm la'isa Shabbos. Again, they're osir for that Shabbos. Because they started Shabbos with only 2 people and their enclosure is too large. So even if another one joins them on Shabbos, it doesn't create a heter for that Shabbos. For that Shabbos, they're still also to be metaltal yoyse b'dalad amas. Aval Shabbos acheres mutter. But if Reuven, Shimon, and Levi are all still out in the bikkah on the next Shabbos, that's fine. Okay, now we go to Sif Gimel. Sif Gimel, it seems a little bit complex. It really isn't. I'm going to give you a hakdama that I think will make going through Sif Gimel really very easy. Sif Gimel builds directly on Sif Aleph. So again, we know now the rules. One person making an enclosure with mechitzos geruos, he's entitled to beis sasayim. He goes over beis sasayim, his mechitzos are ineffective, he's in a karmelis, he can't be metaltal yoyse b'dalad amas. 2 people, same as 1, entitled to beis sasayim with mechitzos geruos. You go over beis sasayim with mechitzos geruos, you're in a karmelis, you can't be metaltal yoyse b'dalad amas. 3 people, shayara. 3 people, your life becomes much easier. Once you have 3 people, you could use mechitzos geruos, and you could make as big an enclosure as you want, as long as you're going to use the whole thing. What happens if you're going to leave empty space? Well, then it depends. 6 saw, you get. I don't care how much empty space you leave. You go over 6 saw, if you leave a beis sasayim ponui, now you're back at a karmelis, also l'taltal, yoyse b'dalad amas. So there's a major halachic difference between 2 and 3. 1 and 2 gets 1 din. 3 and up, you're a shayara. You get a different din. Now the Mechaber is going to give us 2 different cases and going to discuss the possibility of 3 individuals who set up 3 individual enclosures, but they're next to each other. Can they join to form a shayara? And the Mechaber is going to discuss 2 different cases where the 3 encampments that are next to each other are laid out in 2 different ways. And in one case, we're going to see that they can join. In another case, we're going to see that they can't join. And then we're going to have to do the math and find out who messes up who, etc., etc. But there's one rule that really is kind of a foundation for the entire sif, and I'm going to show you that rule now. This involves a concept that we really have discussed already. And that, 2 concepts really. And that is the concept of nifratz b'miluoi, when you have an area that is completely breached to another area. So look at this case over here. In this case, we have 3 people that were in the Bikah, and they set up 3 encampments. Reuven, Shimon, Levi. All of the mechitzas that are here are mechitzas gruos. They're all shesi b'loi erev, erev b'loi shesi. They're mechitza gruos type enclosures. Okay. Reuven sets up camp, Shimon sets up camp, Levi sets up camp. Now, as you can see, Levi is open to Shimon, Shimon is open to Reuven, Reuven's open to Shimon, Shimon is open to Levi, etc., etc., right? Question is, how do we view this? Are they 3 individuals? So each one is entitled only to a Beis Hasayim in his section? Or is this a shayara? Are they 3 people together? Do we join them now? Do we say that they're a shayara and give them the halacha of a shayara? Now, if you notice, Shimon's middle encampment is nifratz b'miluoi. It is wide open, both to Levi on one side and to Reuven on the other side. If you're standing in the middle in Shimon's encampment and you look in either direction, you look to Reuven or you look to Levi, you don't see any mechitzos. You don't see any partitions between you and Reuven or Levi, right? Because Reuven's enclosure is wider than Shimon's, Levi's enclosure is wider than Shimon's. So Shimon is nifratz b'miluoi, both to Reuven and to Levi. Reuven is not nifratz b'miluoi to Shimon, because when you're standing in Reuven's encampment and you look from Reuven's encampment into Shimon's encampment, you see gifufim, partial walls. We already used gifufim in the previous year, right? So when you're in Reuven's encampment and you look at it this way, you see a mechitza. You see a mechitza here. You see a mechitza here. So you see what looks like partial walls that separate you from Shimon. Now, the partial walls don't really separate you from Shimon. The partial walls really separate you from the area outside Shimon's encampment, right? But that's not what you see when you look from Reuven to Shimon. You see a partial wall here, a partial wall here. It looks like a partition, partial partitions between you and Shimon. So too when you're by Levi. You look from Levi to Shimon, you see gifufim between Levi and Shimon. So Reuven is not nifratz b'miluoi to Shimon. Levi is not nifratz b'miluoi to Shimon. But Shimon is nifratz b'miluoi to both. That's one case that the Mechaber is going to give us. Another case the Mechaber is going to give us is really kind of the opposite. In this case, you see that Shimon's encampment, the middle one, is wider than Reuven and Levi. So in this case, Levi is nifratz b'miluoi to Shimon. Reuven is nifratz b'miluoi to Shimon. Shimon is not nifratz b'miluoi to either one. Okay, those are the 2 cases that the Mechaber is going to be discussing. Now, the halacha that's going to form the yesod of what the Mechaber is going to say is the following. The area that is nifratz b'miluoi to another area, so in this case, where Shimon is nifratz b'miluoi to Reuven and to Levi, loses its status, kind of, as being an independent rishus. It is seen as being subjugated or being bottled, in some sense, to Levi's rishus and to Reuven's rishus. Shimon, if you look at the picture, Shimon is kind of like a hallway. There are Rishonim that actually use the word Pesach, that Shimon is kind of like turns into a Pesach, a doorway, an opening, a corridor between Levi and Reuven. Reuven's area, Reuven's enclosure, we could see as being its own chosheva, enclosed independent rishus. Levi's area, we see as being an enclosed chosheva, independent rishus. Shimon, not so much. Shimon really has a partition here. He has a partition here, but then he's nifratz b'milui to the two on the side. So we see Shimon as being somewhat subjugated to Reuven and to Levi. So too, in the other case, where the middle rishus is the wider one, we see it the same way. In this case over here, where Levi is nifratz b'milui to Shimon and Reuven is nifratz b'milui to Shimon, we look at Shimon as being a chosheva independent rishus. We look at Reuven and Levi as being somewhat subjugated to Shimon. Now that's going to make all the difference in the world. Let's see Sif Gimel. Says the Mechaber, Hayu Shloisha. There were three individuals that were out and about in the Bikah. V'yikifu kol echad la'atzmai, and each one made himself an enclosure of mechitzais geruais. Zeh b'tzad zeh. They're all next to each other. Ve'ervu yachad. And, by the way, the Mechaber throws in, and it's the subject of a big machlokes, ve'ervu yachad. They made it a ruvei chatzeros. Because if you don't make it a ruvei chatzeros, if each one is an independent rishus, Reuven is Reuven's, Shimon is Shimon's, Levi is Levi's, and they're open to each other, well, then they aser on each other, right? Then they're each one an independent rishus. You can't carry from one to the other. You can't transfer from one to the other. Can't transfer from Levi's private rishus to Shimon's private rishus without any Reuven chatzeros. So the three of them set up three independent camps, but they made an Reuven chatzeros together. Okay. Im hachitzainim rechavim. We're going to case number one that I showed you. If the two outer rishuyos are wide, v'ha'emtzai katzer, and the middle one is narrow, shenimtza ha'emtzai paritz b'miluai lachitzainim, so that the middle one, Shimon, is nifratz b'miluai to the outer ones, to Reuven and to Levi. V'achitzainim sheyesh lehem gifufim oitfim alav mikol tzad, and the outer ones have gifufim that cut them off from the middle. In that case, noistim lehem kol tzarcham ba'emtzai afilu hu gadol harbe. First thing the Mechaber says is, you should know, in this case, the middle, Shimon, that area could be as big as you want. What does that mean? It means that the middle one, Shimon, has the din of a shayara. And since it has the din of a shayara, it could be as big as you want, as long as you're using all of it, right? It can't have ponu yosem ibeis asayim if it exceeds 6 sa. But you don't have to review the whole share now. But basically, Shimon gets the din of a shayara. And Shimon's middle enclosure could be as big as you want, as long as it's called sarcham, that they're going to use it. And you don't have a base so empty. Afilu gadol harbe. What's the explanation of this, says the Mechaber? The kevon shenasu shayara, I skipped. Afilu gadol harbe. Sha'anu royim ki'ilu kulam darim b'soichai. Because we look at this as if Shimon and Levi, Shimon and Reuven, who are on the outside, we look at it that they actually live together with Shimon in the middle. And now Reuven and Shimon and Levi are all in the middle. And since they're all together in the middle, they're a shayara. What's going on over here? The explanation of this is like what I told you earlier. Since Shimon is nifratz b'miluai to Reuven and Levi, Shimon is subjugated to Reuven and Levi. We look at Shimon as being an extension of Reuven and also an extension of Levi. We look at Shimon as an area that is serving Ruvain's area and serving Levi's area, because it's nifratz b'miluay to both. Now, if Shimon's area is serving Ruvain and serving Levi, that means that Ruvain has a yad in Shimon, Levi has a yad in Shimon. After all, Shimon is subjugated to Ruvain and to Levi. Well, in that case, all three of them have a yad in the middle. So then the middle for sure, says the Mechaber, is a shayara. Now, says the Mechaber, the next chiddush in this. Once you do that, va'af bachitzonim noistel mehem kol tzarcham. Now the outer enclosures could also be as big as you want. Not only could the middle be as big as you want, because they all kind of live together in the middle, the outer ones could also be as big as you want. Why? Because since we see Ruvain, Shimon, and Levi as comprising a shayara in the middle, in Shimon's area, listen, if Ruvain has his own private section out here, and Levi has one out here, and we're saying that Shimon is serving both of them, so basically Ruvain is with Shimon, Levi is with Shimon, well then what are the outer ones? Sounds like the outer ones are a chotzer, they're like courtyards for the middle, where everybody lives happily together. So basically what the Mechaber says, this all started off with Ruvain setting up his enclosure, Shimon setting up his enclosure, Levi setting up his enclosure. Well, if we leave it that way halachically, then each one is a yachid, each one only gets a beis sasayim. But since Shimon is nifratz b'miluay to both outside reshuyos, Shimon is nifratz b'miluay to Ruvain on one side, he's nifratz b'miluay to Levi on the other side. Now Ruvain and Levi are considered together with Shimon in the middle. Now Shimon in the middle is a shayara. It could be as big as it wants. Once there is shayara in the middle, so then the two side ones, says the Mechaber, according to the first opinion here, they become also like tag-alongs to the middle. So they're like chatzerim to the middle. Now the shayara is in the whole thing. Now any part of this could be as big as you want. It all gets a din of a shayara. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Yud Aleph Yikifu Kol Echad, Pirush Yikifu B'Mechitza Gerua. Obviously, we're talking about over here about mechitzas that are made with mechitzas geruos, shasi v'lei erev b'lei shasi. Eis Katan Yud Beis V'Hem Tzoi Kotzer. The middle one is narrower, kozeh. There's a little diagram here. Eis Katan Yud Gimel Gadol Harbe. The middle one could be as big as you want. It could be even Gadol Harbe Yosem Beis Asayim. Eis Katan Yadalit, Shanu Royim, because we see everybody living happily together in the middle. Since the middle is nifratz b'miluay to the two outside ones, there's nothing cutting it off from the outside ones. Well, if there's nothing cutting it off from the outside ones, then Ruvain could flow into Shimon, Levi could flow into Shimon. It's as if they all live together in Shimon. Now, this first opinion said that since the middle is nifratz b'miluay to the two outsides have a yad in the middle is a shayara, the middle could be as big as you want, even bigger than a beis hasayim. The Day Rishona said, now the outsides could also be as big as they want. Why? Because once there is shayara in the middle, the outsides are kind of like chatzerim to the middle. The middle is bottled to the sides. Now the sides is bottled to the middle. Now any part of this triple enclosure could be as big as you want. That was the Day Rishona. Now says the Mechaber v'yeshaim rim, by the Eis Katan Tesvav for the Mishnah Berurah. V'yeshaim rim, says the Mechaber, shachitzonim einam mutarim ela ad sasayim. There's the Yeshaim that says no. We don't do this in both directions. Yes, the middle is nifratz b'miluay to the two sides. So the middle becomes a shayara. The middle could be as big as they want, but not the two sides. The two sides don't get a din of a shayara. V'im echad mehem yosem isasayim, and if one of the two sides is bigger than a beis sasayim, that's a no-no, right? Because the two sides, according to this Yeshaimrim, are only yechidim. Ruvain is alone in one side, Levi's alone in the other side. Those two outside reshuyos are only entitled to a Beis Sasayim. If they went over a Beis Sasayim, then you're not allowed to be metaltal Yosi B'Dal and Amas in the outsides. Ooh, wait a second, says the Mechaber. Then, im echad mehem Yosi B'Sasayim, so it's aser, v'gam hem tzoy aser. Now the middle is also going to be aser. You know why? Because the middle is nifratz b'miluay l'makai ba'aser, right? Do the math. The middle, we said, could be as big as it wants, because the middle is a shayara. But according to this Yesh Omrim, the outside Rishuyos cannot be as big as they want. They can't go over Beis Sasayim. What happens if they do? Well, if they do, you're not allowed to be metaltal Yosef B'Dal Amas inside those outside enclosures. Well, the middle enclosure is nifratz b'miluay to the outside enclosure. If the outside enclosure is also betiltal Yosef B'Dal Amas, then the middle is now going to pick up that halacha because it's nifratz b'miluay l'makom ha'aser. So according to this Yesh Omrim, there's like a double chumrah here. First of all, the Yesh Omrim is machmir more than the Day of Rishona on the outsides. The Day of Rishona says the outsides could be as big as they want. The Day of Shnia says the outsides are limited to a Beis Sasayim. But another chumrah, if they exceed a Beis Sasayim, it's going to destroy the middle. Because the middle is nifratz b'miluay l'makom ha'aser. Sharehu parutz b'miluay. Says the Mishnah Berurah cut in Tesvav. The Yesh Omrim v'halacha kedei kamaisa. The Mishnah Berurah says the halacha follows the Day of Rishona. Will become makom l'chatchila in kedai lahakol, but it's not kedai to be megal. Ois cut in Tezayin ela ad sa sayim. The Yesh Omrim is makmer on the outside and said that they only get as Beis Sasayim. Says the Mishnah Berurah cut in Tezayin. Sharei hein enam rishos echad zemzeh. The outside ones, how do they get more than a Beis Saw? The Yesh Omrim says. They have gifufim. They have the partial walls that cut them off from the middle. So by what logic do they become a shayara? The logic of the Day of Rishona was, the middle is a shayara. No, now the outsides become tuffle to the shayara in the middle. Says the Day of Shnia, the outsides are cut off from the middle. So they're yechidim. They can't get more than a Beis Sasayim. Ois cut in Yud Zayin. Then the second chumrah kicked in. If one of the outsides exceeds a Beis Sa, it becomes also betiltal Yosef B'Dal Amas. Now the middle does too. Why? Because the middle is nifratz b'miluay l'makom ha'aser. Ois cut Yud Zayin. Gamem tzoy aser. Aval ha'kitzay ha'sheni shekin negdo shari. But, points out the Mishnah Berurah, let's say, right, the middle we're good. The middle is the shayara, right? According to the Day of Shnia, Ruvain restricted to a Beis Sasayim. Levi restricted to a Beis Sasayim. What if Ruvain went over a Beis Sasayim? Well, if Ruvain went over a Beis Sasayim, also betiltal Yosef B'Dal Amas. Now, second chumrah, Shimon is also betiltal Yosef B'Dal Amas. Why? Because he's nifratz b'miluay to Ruvain. So he's nifratz b'miluay l'makom ha'aser. How about Levi? Well, if Levi is less than a Beis Sasayim, Levi is sitting pretty. Levi has his Beis Sasayim. He could be metaltal Yosef B'Dal Amas inside his Beis Sasayim because he didn't do anything wrong. He's a yachid. He's got a Beis Sasayim. He's not. You see, it's funny. You could make an argument that no, he's not nifratz b'miluay to Shimon or to Ruvain. Right? He has Shimon in between him and Ruvain. And he's not nifratz b'miluay to anybody. He's got gifufim that cut him off from both Shimon and Ruvain. So even though Ruvain's aser because he exceeded a Beis Sasayim, Shimon's aser because he's nifratz b'miluay to Ruvain, but Levi, as long as he's less than a Beis Sasayim, he's sitting pretty. He's got his enclosure. He could be metaltal Yoser Midalid Amas. No, that we didn't do yet. You know what? I'm going to stop over here before we go to the next case because we're already going long. So we'll do the next case. It should go quickly because we already did the underpinnings of it. It should go quickly. We'll continue with that tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Discussing limud HaTorah. We should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rosh should send Yeshua Serfuas Parnasah and Shadukam to all those in need. We should be zeicher to see the BS God Tzedek B'Meher V'Yameinu Amen. Be well.